Hello. I want to begin today by reading from Joshua chapter 3, verse 1 through to chapter 4, verse 9. It's quite a long passage, so I'll jump little bits from time to time. Early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites went to the Jordan, where they camped before crossing over. After 3 days, the officers went throughout the camp, giving orders to the people. When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits between you and the ark. Do not go near it. Joshua told the people, "Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you." Joshua said to the priests, "Take up the ark of the covenant and pass on ahead of the people." So they took it up and went ahead of them. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so that they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses. Tell the priests who carry the ark of the covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river." Joshua said to the Israelites, "Come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. And as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap." So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the ark of the covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight." So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." So the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priests who carried the ark of the covenant have stood, and they are there to this day. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his own word. This reading tells a familiar story. The Israelites were crossing the river Jordan to enter, finally, the land that God had promised to them. They had left Egypt some 40 years earlier, led by Moses. They'd arrived at the borders of the promised land after just 2 years, but because of their sin and their unwillingness to trust God, they didn't go in. There was no doubt that it was a good land, that it was everything that they'd hoped for. But entering the land brought challenges. There were enemies to face, difficulties to encounter. God promised to be with them, and they had seen how in the past he had helped them and provided for them. But this for them was a step too far, and so they held back, they made excuses, and they didn't go in. And in that way, they were much like us, I suppose. We know what Jesus has done for us. We know what he offers us: forgiveness, peace, joy, purpose in life, the promise that we will be with him forever. But sometimes the cost of following Jesus, the challenges and the difficulties that it brings, the sacrifices that we'll be called on to make, the changes to our way of life, all of these things cause us to hold back from the wholehearted commitment that we're called to make. The good news is, though, that God is loving and gracious, and doesn't give up on us when we make mistakes and when we get things wrong. And so here in Joshua, we find his people again at the entrance to the land, ready to make a new start. By now, Moses is dead, and the people have a new leader, Joshua. He had been Moses' assistant and had been prepared for this important task. But even so, to take over from such a figure as Moses must have seemed very daunting indeed. He must have wondered whether he was really up to it. As he looked back over the way the people had treated Moses, with all of their many complaints and their constant ingratitude as they went through the desert, there may have been also times when Joshua wondered if he really wanted to do the job. But God had called him, and God had given him the assurance that he would be with him. In chapter 1, verses 6 and 9, be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Now, the fact that God tells Joshua not to be afraid tells us that that is just how Joshua was feeling. And in these couple of verses, God tells Joshua to be strong and courageous 3 times. And a little bit later, even the people say it to him. Joshua was clearly feeling the pressure of what he was being called to do. He was afraid, understandably so. But God is bigger than our fears. God is bigger than the tasks that he calls us to face. God is bigger than any of the problems that we might encounter. And he promised to be with Joshua, and that was enough. And so we come to these verses that we read, which is Joshua's first real test. There are some things about what happened here at the Jordan that were familiar. 40 years earlier, when the people came out of Egypt, God had led his people through the Red Sea. On that occasion, we're told, the waters stood up in a heap. And we see the same thing here at the Jordan in verse 13. On that occasion, too, we're told that the people were able to cross on dry ground. And that same expression is used when the people crossed the Jordan. And it seems to me that there is a deliberate link between the two. And we'll come on to that. But as we look at this incident, that's the first thing that I want to focus on. God's power in the past. God's power in the past. Remembering what God has done is an important part of Jewish and Christian traditions. We talked a little bit about this last week. Every year, Israel celebrated a series of festivals which reminded them of what God had done. At Passover, they remembered the escape from Egypt. At Pentecost, they remembered the covenant at Sinai. The Feast of Tabernacles recalled the way God had helped and protected them through the desert, and so on. For Christians, we have traditional festivals, Christmas, Easter, and so on. And even more importantly, we have our regular communion service, where we break bread and drink wine and remember Christ's sacrifice for us. And as we do so, we pledge ourselves in continuing obedience and service to him and continuing service and love for one another. And as I said last week, that is something we miss in these days of lockdown and something we look forward to sharing in again as soon as the opportunity comes. These things are important. They help us to understand who we are. They help us to see that we're part of a continuing story of grace and faith. We're part of something much bigger than ourselves. This story that we are part of links us with Abraham, with Jacob, with Moses, with Joshua, with David in the Old Testament. It links us with those disciples who sat at the table with Jesus as he took bread and wine and handed it to them as reminders of his body and blood and of his coming sacrifice. It links us with Peter and Paul. It links us with the great men and women of faith down through the Christian centuries. Their story is our story, and that is something amazing. Joshua at the Red Sea was at the Red Sea, and he would have remembered very clearly what an amazing event it was. He saw Moses hold his staff over the waters and saw God part the waters to allow his people to cross over and then bring them back over the pursuing Egyptian army. And such a demonstration of God's power would have helped to build his faith and confidence now. Thinking back, though, might also have been a little disconcerting. As Joshua prepared to lead the people across the Jordan, and as he thought about the Red Sea, it would be, on the one hand, a great confidence boost. God has done this before and he can do it again. On the other, though, when God did it before, he did it for Moses. And Joshua knew very well that he wasn't Moses. And so there may very well have been that element of doubt. Will he do it for me? The text answers that unspoken concern. The Lord said to Joshua, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so that they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses." What God had done through Moses, he promises to do through Joshua. Yes, Moses may have been a great leader. Indeed, he may have been one of the greatest figures in Israel's history. He may have had an especially close relationship with God. And the Bible talks about God talking to Moses face to face, as a man talks to his friend. But in the end, it's God, not Moses, who works the miracles. Miracles depend ultimately on his power, not ours. On who he is, not on who we are. And he can work through anyone. In the New Testament, James encourages believers to pray, and he uses the example of Elijah. Now, his readers and you and I might say, well, that's Elijah. We expect God to answer his prayers. But James says Elijah was a man just like us. He had great faith, great commitment. But in the end, he was just like us, a human being. He, like us, was reliant on God. And that same God is at work in the world and through the lives and prayers of his people today. And that includes through the lives of you and me. It is God's power, and it is available to every man and woman of faith. And that's something that some preachers and healers need to be reminded of. So Joshua had this wonderful reminder of what God had done in the past. And that would encourage him as he faced a similar task and a similar challenge. And we too can be encouraged as we seek to serve God and to fill our particular calling, knowing that the same faithful, powerful God is also with us. Remembering the past is important. We've quoted the hymn "Begone Unbelief" several times in the past, but the words are still relevant. His love in time past forbids me to think he'll leave me at last in trouble to sink. And can he have taught me to trust in his name, and thus far have brought me to put me to shame? And of course the answer is no. The God who was with us in the past is with us now. The God who has carried us through in the past is there to carry us through now. As I've said, that's an important part of our faith as Christians. But we don't spend our lives looking back. The lessons of the past need to be applied to the present. And so the second point is God's presence now. Why do we look back? Why do we remember the past? To remind ourselves that we are part of a continuing story and that what God has done, he can do again. In other words, the past reaches forward into the present. It touches our lives today. Joshua stands now where Moses stood, and he looks to the same God who was with Moses to perform a miracle. When the people of Israel were in exile, they looked to the same God who had once brought them out of Egypt to do the same thing now and bring them out of exile in Babylon. And Isaiah and other prophets talk about the return from exile as a second Exodus, when God will again deliver his people. When the New Testament writers reflected on the death and resurrection of Jesus, they saw him as the Passover lamb, bringing a new deliverance, not now from Egypt or from Babylon, but from slavery to sin and death. And Paul encourages believers by reminding us that the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead is in us, giving life to our mortal bodies. The God who was active in the past is still working. He is doing now what he was doing then. And we can see the patterns and the parallels between then and now. And that reassures us, that encourages us. But there is a challenge that goes with this, and that is to trust God in the present. Joshua has the encouragement of knowing what God can do. But now he must apply that to the present, to the new situation that he finds himself in. Joshua can't simply do what Moses did and expect it all to happen in exactly the same way. He needs to listen and to be obedient to what God is saying to him now in the present. And although the miracle is similar, the instructions that God gives are very different. Moses was told to stretch his staff over the Red Sea. Here, Joshua is given instructions for the priests. The priests carrying the ark go first, and they go into the water. It is only then that the water stopped flowing, as their feet touched the water. And then as the priests stood in the river like some kind of river traffic warden, holding back the waters, the people crossed over on dry ground. Now that was the plan that Joshua shared with the priests and the people. And as you can imagine, they might not have been too thrilled with it, especially the priests. They were the ones that had to walk into the river first and make their way into the middle. They were told that the water would stop when their feet first went into the river. But what if it didn't? And I have that picture of them walking further and further out into the river with the water getting higher and higher, and them asking the question, Lord, how long before this water stops? The point I'm making here is that though God has done something like this before, obedience and trust in a new situation are not easy. But it's vital if we're to see God at work now as he was at work then. There is an interesting statement in verse 4. The people are told to follow the priests with the ark because they're told, you have never been this way before. Now, of course, this is unfamiliar territory to them. They haven't been in that location before. When they came to the borders of the promised land in the past, it was in a different place. But this is about more than geography. They don't need to follow the priests in order to find their way to the river. But the way to victory, the way to face up to and overcome the challenges that they were now facing, that is something they don't know. Only God knows that. The challenge to their faith as they cross the Jordan is not something they have encountered. They have not been that way before. And the same is true for us. Our knowledge of God and what God has done and what we know God can do encourages us. And in the light of that, we can walk into what for us may be unknown territory. There was a popular song some years ago with the words, I've never had to go this far before, but I'm trusting in you to see me through. And that's where Joshua and Israel were. And that's where we often find ourselves. But each time we take a new step forward and we discover God's faithfulness, it encourages us to take another and another. After this miracle, the people were told to set up a pillar of stones from the bed of the river. That pillar would be a permanent reminder, and the writer tells us that the stones were still there in his day of what God had done. As the people went into Canaan, there would be tough times ahead, but Joshua and the people would be able to look back at what God had done, not just for Moses and the people who came out of Egypt, but for them under Joshua. They had discovered for themselves just how faithful and how powerful God was. And it's interesting that on two occasions in this passage, it talks about God being the Lord of all the earth. There is no doubt about God's power. What the people need to be reminded of, and what we need to be reminded of as well, is that same God, the God of all the earth, the God whose power is without limit, the God who has done miracles in the past, is with us in the present. And he can work through us today. And the emphasis here is all on God, not on personalities, not on what Joshua or Moses. It is on the ark, which is the symbol of God's presence and indeed represents God's throne. It wasn't Joshua who had parted the river. Just as in the past, it wasn't Moses who parted the sea. God did it. The waters had obeyed his command, And this same God would be with his people to guide and protect them through all the troubled times that lay ahead. And the same is true for us. The God who has brought his people thus far will continue to lead and to guide. The God who has blessed his people and has blessed us in so many ways in the past will continue to bless. We have the confidence that the same God who is and who remains the Lord of history and the Lord of creation is with us to strengthen us and to enable us to serve him in whatever situation we find ourselves today. Amen.